There's a farmhouse still standing in the hills of eastern Kentucky. No one lives there anymore. The windows are boarded. The porch sags into the dirt. But if you walk up the gravel road on a quiet afternoon, you can still see the names carved into the doorframe. Brothers, sisters, husbands, wives. The same surnames, repeated over and over, generation after generation. 14 times, they say. 14 generations where brother married sister, cousin wed cousin, and the family tree didn't branch, it circled back on itself like a noose. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This happened. And what came after, what those children looked like, what those families became, was never supposed to leave that valley. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They called it keeping the bloodline pure. They called it tradition. They called it survival. But by the 10th generation, the babies stopped crying when they were born. By the 12th, some of them stopped looking human at all. And by the 14th, the family had become something else entirely, something that medical science still doesn't have a name for. This story begins in the early 1700s, when a small group of English settlers pushed deep into the Appalachian wilderness, far beyond the reach of any government, any church, any law. They built their homes in a hidden valley, surrounded by ridges so steep that sunlight only touched the ground for a few hours each day. They wanted isolation. They got it. And in that isolation, they made a choice that would echo through centuries. The first marriage between siblings happened in 1723. A brother and sister, both in their teens, wed in secret beneath an oak tree. No preacher, no witnesses, just a vow, whispered in the dark. The family approved. In fact, they encouraged it. Because out there, in that valley, there was no one else. No neighboring farms, no traveling merchants. Just them. And if the family was going to survive, they believed, it had to stay within itself. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that they had just lit a fuse that would burn for 300 years. By 1750, the pattern was no longer an accident. It was policy. The family, later known in medical records only as Family G, to protect their descendants, had grown to nearly 40 members, all living within a few miles of one another. And every single marriage, without exception, was between blood relatives, brother to sister, first cousin to first cousin, uncle to niece. The family tree had become a wreath. The elders justified it with scripture, with tradition, with fear. They told the younger generation that outsiders carried disease, that they couldn't be trusted, that marriage beyond the bloodline would dilute their strength. But the real reason, historians believe, was darker and simpler. Control. By keeping marriages within the family, the patriarchs kept the land, the money, and the power in a tight circle. No one could leave. No one could inherit property and take it elsewhere. The valley was a kingdom, and they were its kings. For the first few generations, the consequences were subtle. A child born with a clubfoot here, a girl with a wandering eye there, minor defects, easy to overlook. The family convinced themselves it was normal. After all, they had no comparison. They had no idea what was happening inside their own cells, where chromosomes were colliding, where recessive genes normally buried and harmless were meeting their identical twins and triggering disasters the body was never meant to survive. By 1800, the fourth generation, the signs were undeniable. Children were being born deaf. Some were blind. Others had seizures that lasted for hours, their small bodies convulsing in the dirt while their parents prayed and wept. But still, the marriages continued. Still, brother wed sister. Still, the family closed ranks and told itself that this was God's will. One journal entry, discovered in a crumbling Bible in 1976, was written by a woman named Abigail in 1813. She wrote, "My son was born today. He has no roof to his mouth. I can see into his skull." The midwife wept and turned away. "My husband says we will try again, but I know this is not the Lord's work. This is ours." Abigail's son lived for 3 days. He couldn't nurse. He couldn't breathe properly. On the third night, he stopped moving. They buried him in the family cemetery, a plot that was already crowded with tiny graves. He was the 9th infant to die that year. There were only 12 families in the valley, and still, no one spoke of leaving. No one spoke of bringing in outsiders. The valley had become a trap, and the family was both prisoner and warden. By 1860, something had fundamentally changed. The 7th generation wasn't just sick, they were different. Medical anthropologists who studied the family's records decades later described it as genetic collapse. The human body, they said, is resilient. It can survive hardship, disease, even trauma. But it cannot survive itself. And after 7 generations of inbreeding, the body began to fail in ways that seemed almost deliberate, almost like punishment. Children were born with their organs on the outside of their bodies. Others had faces that didn't fully form, no nose, no jaw, just smooth skin where features should have been. One infant, according to a county death record from 1862, was described only as incompatible with life. The doctor who signed the certificate refused to elaborate. Years later, in a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "I have seen war. I have seen fever take entire families. But what I saw in that valley was something else. It was as if nature itself had turned against them." But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. The family adapted. They stopped seeking outside help. They stopped inviting doctors. They built their own systems of care, their own rituals. When a child was born too deformed to survive, they would take it into the woods and leave it there. Not out of cruelty, they believed, but out of mercy. They called it returning them to the earth. By the time the 8th generation came of age, this was standard practice. Expected, normal, and yet, life continued. Somehow, enough children survived barely to keep the family going. They were smaller now, frailer. Many couldn't speak, even as adults. Others couldn't walk, but they could still reproduce. And so the cycle continued. One broken generation giving birth to the next, each one a little more twisted than the last. In 1879, a traveling preacher passed through the valley. He stayed one night. In his journal, later found in a church archive in West Virginia, he wrote, "I have seen the face of damnation. There is a family here that has turned its back on God and nature both. The children do not look like children. The parents do not speak of them with love, but with shame and resignation. I offered to pray with them. They refused. I left at dawn and have not returned. I do not believe the Lord's light reaches that place anymore." He never named the family. He never gave the location, but researchers believe he was describing Family G. And by that point, they were only halfway through their genetic descent. The 7th generation had 23 live births. Only 9 survived past the age of 5. Of those 9, 6 were able to reproduce. And they did, because in that valley, there was no other option. There was no escape. There was only bloodline, and the terrible weight of what it had become. 1917. The world was at war. Young men across America were being drafted, sent overseas, pulled from their farms and their families. But in the valley, no one came to recruit. No government official ever arrived, because by then, the family had become invisible. Census takers skipped their roads. Mail carriers refused to deliver. The few neighbors who remained nearby had long since stopped asking questions. There were rumors. Of course, whispers in the nearby town about the hollow people, about children who didn't come out in daylight, about a family that had gone so far inward it had disappeared entirely. But it was in 1917 that something shifted. A young woman later referred to in medical documents as Subject 12 did something no one in the family had done in nearly 200 years. She left. She walked out of the valley in the middle of the night, pregnant and alone, and made her way to a neighboring county. She found work at a textile mill. She gave birth in a charity hospital, and for the first time, a doctor from outside the family saw what 14 generations of inbreeding had created. The report, filed with the state health department and later buried in an archive, described the infant as profoundly abnormal. The child had no fingers, only small flaps of skin where hands should have been. The legs were fused together from hip to ankle. The skull was misshapen, soft in places, with gaps that never closed. But what disturbed the doctor most, he wrote, was the child's eyes. They were open, but they didn't track movement. They didn't blink. He wasn't sure, he admitted, if the child could see at all, or if it even understood that it was alive. Subject 12 refused to speak about her family. She wouldn't give names, wouldn't name the father, wouldn't say where she had come from. When social workers pressed her, she simply said, "It's how we've always been." The baby died 6 weeks later. Subject 12 disappeared shortly after. Some believe she returned to the valley. Others think she died trying to escape it a second time. No record of her exists after 1918, but her brief appearance had consequences. The state launched a quiet investigation. A team of officials, accompanied by a doctor and a county sheriff, traveled into the valley in the spring of 1919. What they found was never officially published. The report was classified, then lost, then rediscovered in the 1980s by a graduate student researching Appalachian isolation. The details were sparse, clinical, almost cold. But even through the bureaucratic language, the horror was clear. They found 31 people living in 4 structures. Most were unable to communicate. Several were blind. Others had severe physical deformities, twisted spines, missing limbs, faces that seemed to collapse inward. The team noted that many of the adults appeared mentally deficient, though whether this was genetic or environmental, they couldn't say. What shocked them most was how normalized it all seemed. The families cared for each other. They shared food. They even smiled, in their way. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply survival in a world that had long ago stopped making sense. The officials left after 2 days. They took photographs, though none have surfaced publicly. They recommended immediate intervention, but nothing happened. The valley was too remote, the family too far gone, and perhaps, some historians believe, the state simply didn't want to acknowledge what had been allowed to happen in its own borders. By 1940, the family had reached its 13th generation. There were fewer than 20 members left. Most couldn't work. Most couldn't marry, even within the family, because their bodies had become too damaged to carry children to term. Miscarriages were constant. Stillbirths were expected. The family cemetery, by now, held more graves than the valley had living souls. But they tried. God, they tried. Because to stop trying meant admitting what they had done. It meant facing the truth that their bloodline hadn't been preserved, it had been destroyed. And so, the last few fertile members continued the pattern. A brother in his 40s married his teenage niece. A cousin wed his cousin, both of them barely able to walk, both of them knowing that whatever child they produced would likely not survive. It wasn't love. It wasn't even desperation anymore. It was ritual, automatic. The family doing what it had always done because no one remembered how to do anything else. The 14th generation was born between 1955 and 1968. There were 4 children. Only 2 survived infancy. And what survived, according to sealed medical records obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2003, barely qualified as survival. 1 child, a boy, was born without a brain. Not a malformed brain. No brain at all. Just a brain stem, enough to keep the heart beating, the lungs inflating. He lived for 11 months in a crib in a back room, fed through a tube, never crying, never moving. His mother sat with him every day until he finally stopped breathing. She buried him herself. The other child, a girl, lived longer. She's still alive today, in fact, though her location is protected by law. She was born with a condition so rare that fewer than a dozen cases have ever been documented worldwide. Her bones never hardened. Her skull remained soft, collapsing slightly inward as she grew. By the time she was 10, she couldn't stand. By 20, she couldn't speak. She's now in her 60s, living in a state-funded care facility under an assumed name. She has no children. She is the last of Family G. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By the early 1970s, the valley was empty. Some members had died, others had been quietly removed by social services and placed in institutions. A few simply vanished, their fates unknown. The farmhouses were abandoned, the fields went wild. The family cemetery, overgrown and forgotten, became a place that locals avoided. not because of superstition, but because of something heavier. Shame, grief, the sense that something unforgivable had happened there, and no amount of time would ever make it right. In 1983, a team of geneticists from a university in Virginia received permission to study the family's medical records. What they found confirmed what they had suspected. This was one of the most extreme cases of inbreeding ever documented in modern history. The genetic diversity of the final generation, they calculated, was less than that of a typical sibling pair. In some areas, it was closer to that of identical twins. The family hadn't just intermarried, they had become genetically indistinguishable from one another. They had collapsed into themselves. To understand what happened to family G, you have to understand what happens inside the body when bloodlines fold in on themselves. Every human carries mutations, small errors in our DNA, passed down from our parents, hidden in our genes like landmines waiting to be triggered. Most of the time, they never activate. Because we inherit 2 copies of every gene, one from each parent, and if one copy is damaged, the other usually compensates. It's the body's backup system. It's how we survive. But when siblings have children, that system breaks down. Because siblings share so much DNA, the chance that both will carry the same mutation and pass it to their child skyrockets. Suddenly, there's no backup. The landmine detonates. And the result is what geneticists call a recessive disorder. Conditions that would normally appear once in every 10,000 births start appearing in every other child. Deafness, blindness, organ failure, deformities so severe the body can't sustain life. Now imagine that happening not once, but across 14 generations. Imagine every damaged gene finding its mirror, every hidden flaw surfacing, every weak link in the genetic chain snapping one after another. By the 5th generation, family G had lost nearly half of their genetic diversity. By the 10th, they had less genetic variation than a purebred dog. And by the 14th, they had essentially become clones of their ancestors, carrying every mistake, every mutation, every inherited defect in compounding layers. The results were catastrophic. Children were born with conditions that don't even have names. One medical report described spontaneous skeletal malformations where bones would grow in spirals, twisting the limbs into unusable shapes. Another documented a child born with 2 faces, not conjoined twins, but a single skull with 2 incomplete sets of features, neither functional. There were cases of children born without skin, their bodies covered only in a thin membrane that tore at the slightest touch. They rarely lived more than a few hours. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect wasn't the physical deformities, it was the cognitive decline. By the 12th generation, the average IQ of surviving members had dropped below 50. Most couldn't read. Many couldn't speak in full sentences. Some couldn't recognize their own reflections. The family had become intellectually disabled, not through any single condition, but through the accumulated weight of centuries of genetic damage. Their brains, like their bodies, had been crushed under the pressure of their own bloodline. In 2007, a documentary crew tried to locate surviving members of Family G. They found 3. All were in their 70s or 80s. All were in care facilities. None could give interviews. One woman, when shown photographs of the old farmhouse, began to cry. She couldn't explain why. The crew left after 20 minutes, feeling, they said, like they had intruded on something too private, too painful to film. The scientific community has studied Family G extensively, though always at a distance, always with aliases and redacted locations. They're cited in textbooks on genetics, in papers on inbreeding depression, in case studies on the limits of human survival. But the family itself, the people, have been erased. Their real names are gone. Their graves are unmarked. The valley where they lived has been reclaimed by the forest. The roads washed out, the houses collapsed into themselves. It's as if the earth decided to bury the evidence, as if even nature wanted to forget. There's a question that haunts every researcher who has ever studied Family G. It's not a scientific question. It's not about genetics or chromosomes or recessive traits. The question is simpler and far more disturbing. Why didn't they stop? Because they knew. By the 5th generation, they knew. By the 7th, when children were being born without faces, when infants died in their arms week after week, they knew. And yet they continued. Generation after generation, they made the same choice, performed the same rituals, married brother to sister, cousin to cousin, absolutely knowing what the result would be. Some researchers believe it was isolation, that after so many years in the valley, cut off from the world, the family simply forgot there was another way. Others think it was religion, a twisted belief that suffering was holy, that God was testing them, that if they remained pure long enough, they'd be rewarded. Still others suggest something darker, that, by the middle generations, the family had become so intellectually diminished that they literally couldn't understand cause and effect anymore, that they had lost the capacity to see the pattern, to connect their marriages to their children's suffering. But there's another possibility, one that's harder to accept. Maybe they did understand. Maybe they saw exactly what was happening, and maybe, in some broken way, they believed they had no choice. Because to admit that the bloodline was poisoned meant admitting that everything, every marriage, every birth, every death had been for nothing. It meant admitting that their ancestors had made a mistake so profound, so catastrophic, that it could never be undone. And that truth perhaps was more unbearable than watching another child die. In 2012, the last public record of Family G surfaced. It was a death certificate for a man in his early 60s, a member of the 13th generation. Cause of death: heart failure. But in the section where family history is recorded, the attending physician had written something unusual. He noted that the patient had no known relatives, no siblings, no children, no parents still living. And then, in parentheses, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Patient reports he is the last." He wasn't. There's still the woman in the care facility, the one from the 14th generation, the final child. But in a sense, he was right. Because whatever Family G had been, a family, a community, a bloodline, it no longer exists. The genetics remain, scattered and diluted in a handful of aging bodies. But the thing itself, the unbroken chain that stretched back 300 years, is gone. The valley is still there. You can find it, if you know where to look, though it's not easy. The roads are barely roads anymore. The landmarks have been reclaimed by trees and kudzu and time. But if you walk far enough, you'll find the cemetery. The stones are mostly illegible now, worn smooth by weather and neglect, but you can still make out some of the names. And if you stand there long enough, you'll notice something. The same names, over and over. The same dates, too close together, generation after generation, buried side by side, until the pattern becomes unmistakable. There's no historical marker, no plaque, nothing to tell you what happened here. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe some stories aren't meant to be remembered. Maybe some truths are too uncomfortable to preserve. But they happened. Family G happened. 14 generations happened. And somewhere, in locked archives and sealed medical files, and the fading memories of social workers who saw things they were told never to speak about, the evidence remains. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't legend. This was real. And the most terrifying part isn't what happened to them. It's how easy it was for the rest of us to let it happen, to look away, to forget, to let an entire bloodline destroy itself in silence, in a hidden valley, while the world moved on. The last surviving member of Family G will likely die within the next decade. When she does, the bloodline ends. 3 centuries of choices, of mistakes, of suffering, will finally be over. The valley will remain. The graves will remain. But the family, the terrible, tragic thing they became, will be gone. And maybe that's mercy. Or maybe it's just the inevitable end of a story that should never have been written in the first place. Thank you for watching. If this story affected you, let us know in the comments. And remember, history doesn't always come with warnings. Sometimes it just comes with consequences.